Our next speaker is no stranger to NACo. He comes from local government and understands our role in meeting the transportation needs of our communities. He is certainly no stranger here in Will County. Actually, he's our next door neighbor. Please join me as we welcome the 19th Secretary of Transportation, the Honorable Pete Buttigieg. Thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm delighted to be with NACo. I've had a high regard for this organization, especially since I was able to join your annual meeting some 5 or 6 years ago to discuss our work for veterans. And I'm delighted to be working with you now in a new capacity on transportation and infrastructure.
Thank you. We have about 12 minutes for this segment, so I'm going to get right into the questions so our audiences can hear from you. Yesterday, we saw you discuss your priorities with the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Can you outline those priorities for us and also share your main goal as Secretary?
Yes, thank you. Yesterday was a great opportunity to discuss the future and where we're headed as a country when it comes to infrastructure. Before coming to that, I do want to take a moment just to thank you for the work that you did building support for the American Rescue Plan, which it was the biggest piece of business we had to attend to right away. It entails more than $60 billion going directly to county governments and local governments for local need. And we recognize that you have been at the absolute forefront of contending with COVID and taking care of your residents, and are enthusiastic about the potential of this rescue plan funding to help. Now that that has been achieved, although there's a long way to go, of course, in effectively implementing it, but when it comes to Congress and the work ahead, we now have an opportunity to move forward into an infrastructure vision that was part of what I was discussing yesterday before Congress. There are a lot of unmet needs in this country. I don't have to tell any county official or local official what we're up against. Over $1 trillion just in the backlog of maintenance for what we've already got, roads and bridges, plus the need to make sure we are upgrading our airports, our waterways, our communities' infrastructure in order to be ready for the future. Right now, I believe American competitiveness depends on us making a generational investment, a once-in-a-lifetime kind of investment in American infrastructure, from things that people think about and see every day, like roads and bridges, to things you don't hear about as much, like our national airspace, and things that have become much a part of our infrastructure as traditional roads and bridges, like digital infrastructure and the need for broadband. As we do this, we have to prioritize, first and foremost, safety. The reason my department exists is to help ensure the safety of the traveling public. We have to do this in a way that boosts the economic competitiveness of all of our communities, urban and rural alike, in every part of the US. We got to do it in a way that is responsible toward our climate needs, knowing that we are on a trajectory that can't be sustained, but we could get on a better trajectory, create a lot of jobs while we do it. We know that we've got to do this in an equitable fashion, something America has not always successfully done, but we can get it right this time. And we know that we have to transform our infrastructure for the future that's going to include technologies that would have sounded fanciful just a few years ago, but are now very much upon us, from the electrification of vehicles to autonomous driving and things that radically change what it's like to move around in our communities and around the country. The challenges are enormous, but so is the opportunity, and I'm eager to work with you to make sure we rise to meet this once-in-a-lifetime moment.
We look forward to working more with you. Speaking of the American Rescue Plan, that made an historic investment in counties. In addition to the much-needed direct relief the legislature provided to counties, it also included over $30 billion, that's billion, dollars for public transit systems, nearly 80% of which counties directly support. What is your vision for expanding transit options and ensuring all Americans have access? And I'm thinking especially of those in the more marginalized communities.
Well, it's a great point, a very important issue, and I was so glad that the rescue plan included that kind of funding for transit. Again, I don't have to tell you what was at stake here. We saw transit agencies that had their revenue absolutely demolished by what was going on with COVID. And as a consequence, many were having to contemplate cutting routes, cutting frequency, and even laying off workers. Those billions of dollars in the rescue plan are designed to stop that emergency. We've also got to have a longer term and bigger picture vision for transit. And one of the things I think that county officials are in a unique position to educate the public and the Congress about is that transit is not only a concern for our biggest metropolitan areas and coastal cities, as you know well, because you're responsible for guiding this. It is in our mid-sized, small, and rural communities and counties that transit is often an absolute lifeline for marginalized and minoritized groups that have been too often left out of transportation decision-making in the past. We want to make sure transit is a means of choice for people to get around, whether they own a car or not. But we also want to recognize that many people are fully dependent on transit in order to be able to get to where they need to be. And in that sense, especially if you need transit in order to get to a good paying job, the gateway to the American dream is transit. It's one of the many reasons why the Federal Transit Administration is working so hard to deploy the resources that were in the American Rescue Plan. And it's why future moves on surface transportation bills and on the President's infrastructure vision will be taking this into account.
Many of us know you as Mayor Pete, a former local official. So you certainly know the value of a strong federal, state, and local partnership. At NACo, we believe in partnerships and want to work with you. What direction can you give us on how to work with you to achieve our shared goals? How can we support you?
Well, thank you. One of the most important things you can do, as I shared earlier, is to help educate the public and the Congress and the media about what's at stake, about why we can't go on with a $1 trillion infrastructure deficit, which means very specific things in the communities that you serve. If you're from a colder climate like I am, you know that this time of year is pothole season when the ice has done its worst to our roads. And that's just one example of the kinds of issues that your constituents hold you accountable for dealing with. And they don't follow all the twists and turns of what goes on in congressional procedure. They just want you to fix it. And they expect it to get done. These are the kinds of things I think you can help remind everybody of. Now, we have a responsibility too, here in this department and in Washington, to be user-friendly for the communities that are approaching us for support. It's why we have a lot of grant programs that are directly available for counties or coalitions of counties to apply to. And we're trying to make sure we make that process as straightforward as possible. Even if you don't get a competitive grant, we want to work with you to talk about how the application could be stronger for the next time around. And we want to be transparent and consistent about what it is it takes in order to succeed in these discretionary grant programs, as well as how to work with us on those formula funds that go out on a mandatory basis. Let me mention one other thing. I've noticed since I've come to Washington that around here, people use the word state and local, they say, almost as if it's the same thing. And of course, any of us who have worked in local government know it doesn't quite work that way. Local leaders partner with the states that they're in, but states don't always see things from that critically important local perspective. The most bipartisan perspective I know, by the way, is that of being on the ground. So I do want to make sure that as a department, we don't always require you to go through multiple layers of government in order to get our attention. Yes, there are some things that flow through the states, but we also want to make sure there's a direct relationship, because I think that's a very important part of federalism and one that we need to do right by here at the department. So you'll never catch me assuming that if we're interacting with states, then the concerns of counties or communities are taken care of. We want to do all of the above, working with local as well as state and territorial and tribal authorities to try to serve people the best we can.
Well, NACo is certainly glad to hear that, and we want to partner with you. You mentioned the struggle of local agencies trying to get work done, and a piece of that is permit streamlining. Sometimes the current process can delay and significantly increase the price tag for the simplest of local projects, like repairing a sidewalk, even once a categorical exclusion is secured. Do you see areas in the permitting process that could benefit from common sense reforms? And we know common sense is very uncommon, but from common sense reforms that could ultimately lend themselves to expediting the country's transition toward meeting President Biden's goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050?
It's a great question. And the answer is yes, I do think there are a lot of opportunities. And we want to hear from you about where the best opportunities are. Look, if you've ever even been considered for a full environmental impact statement, or even if you're just pursuing an EA or a categorical exclusion, you know how much complexity is involved in those permitting processes. Now, of course, they exist for a good reason. And I'm not talking about wanting to cut corners on any of the environmental or community or worker protection or other concerns that are written into the law. But there have got to be more efficient and user-friendly ways to make sure that those goals are met. So I've challenged my own team to look for where some of those opportunities are. We also want to work with states to make sure there is as little duplication as possible in the things that you at the local level have to deal with, both on the state and the federal front. And we want to make sure that we're keeping with the times. I know that most counties aren't in a position to have a federal relations expert on staff to know how to navigate these processes, which is part of why I feel a responsibility to try to make them as straightforward as possible. Now, of course, no matter how good we get, no matter how efficient we get on the permitting side, and I do know that that is a real issue, no matter how good we get at that, the number one reason why a project doesn't get done is a lack of funding. And that's the thing we have a huge opportunity to do something about at a moment where we have bipartisan interest, demonstrated need, public attention, congressional attention, and I can tell you a very supportive president to do something big this time around.
We are certainly glad to hear that here at NACo, Mr. Secretary. And I'm afraid we are at the end of our time, but we look forward to having the opportunity to speak with you further, come visit you in DC, and get your help on all the projects that are going forward across the country. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for hosting me virtually. I'd be delighted to welcome you to Washington as soon as we safely can. And in the meantime, look forward to being in close touch about how we can work together.
Thank you.